In Ivory Coast, no official statement or comment on the 2020 presidential elections in the country. Ivorians remain on hold. The current president consults his political base and the opposition parties are already regrouping, and the presidential elections are far from over. Unexpectedly appointed after the resignation of Soumeylou Boubèye Maïga, his predecessor, following a motion of censure tabled against him at the National Assembly, the new Prime Minister, Dr. Boubou Cissé, was welcomed by a burst of negative opinions. These are our top stories. Stay tuned for more details in this newscast. Since the resignation of Omar el-Bashir from power, the transition has so far been handled by the Transitional Military Council and will not change hands. Indeed, as reported by a senior official of the army, after a great number of meetings between the military and civilians, agreements were finally found. Among these agreements, there was need to agree on who should chair the Joint Council, which was until last week the major issue during discussions. According to this new statement, the head of the Transitional Military Council, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, remains head of state. 48 hours was the new deadline granted by the opposition and the Transitional Military Council to define certain points, including the terms Joint Council of Sovereignty and the division of its composition between civilians and military, in addition to tasks assigned to each one, but especially to the leader of the Joint Council. In office for nearly 1 month, this general, considered as reliable, who had already started discussions with protesters, plans to restore power to civilians within 2 years and reinstate democracy in the country. It is close, the time for the presidential elections in Ivory Coast, but yet all the parties involved play the card of the political correct attitude. Awareness for a peaceful vote continues. Potential candidates are looming on the horizon. Officially, no cat is let out of the bag. Guillaume Soro, former ally of Alassane Ouattara, announced that he had left the National Assembly for a more comfortable armchair without specifying which one. The current president, whose constitution does not allow a third term, has not yet disclosed his intentions. Despite the departure of his former allies, the case of Henri Konan Bédié and Guillaume Soro, Alassane Dramane Ouattara organizes different meetings, keeping everyone in suspense regarding the 2020 presidential election. This election raises suspicions of tension and worries many observers of politics in Côte d'Ivoire. In addition to the release by the International Criminal Court of the former president and rival of Alassane Ouattara during the election of 2011, which resulted in a war, killing more than 3,000 people, and his loyal lieutenant, Charles Blé Goudé. Before the presidential elections of 2020, the new approach by President Ouattara also aims at marking the ground by trying to weave a new social pact with the tribal chiefs and kings of the country, who still have a certain influence on their citizens. It is therefore a long period of observation. No one officially utters a word. Everyone observes and waits until the right moment to kick off, and those familiar with the political arena are awaiting the ultimate moment to conquer the most comfortable and coveted post. After the resignation of Soumeylou Boubèye Maïga following a motion of censure tabled against him at the National Assembly, Dr. Boubou Cissé, former Minister of the Economy and Finance in the outgoing team, was appointed Prime Minister. His appointment was followed by a burst of adverse opinion in the same proportions of jubilation, hailing the departure of his predecessor. The preference given to Boubou Cissé is nonetheless based on a few objective criteria and rational considerations. In addition to being one of the 2 ministers to break the record of constancy since Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta became President of the Republic, it appears as a vote of confidence from IBK. The former boss of the mining department is also an incomparable link between the 2 main poles of the Malian political scene and can be perceived as a neutral actor without any political ambitions. Unlike many of his predecessors whose political agenda was sometimes confused with sovereign missions, the successor of Soumeylou Boubèye Maïga has engaged in all-out consultations in order to form a government of broad openness that his employer strongly calls for as a way to normalize his rapport with the opposition and overcome major security challenges and stabilization in the pace impelled or imposed by the international community. According to local press, it is clear that the road ahead is painful, if not impossible, given the obstacles the new head of government is facing, which probably explains the difficulty in forming a government team after nearly 2 weeks following appointment. After 30 years and 5 months of reign, the Japanese Emperor Akihito hands over to his eldest son this April 30th. Crown Prince Naruhito becomes the 126th King of Japan. This is the first time in 2 centuries that a Japanese emperor gives up his function during his lifetime by virtue of an exception law written specially for Akihito. The latter had subtly expressed in 2016 his wish to be relieved of his task. Aged 85 with a declined health, he could no longer effectively carry out his multiple tasks. The Japanese population is thus preparing for historical and unpublished festivities, since this time the nation is not bereaved by the death of the king, as it was the case during previous successions in 1989. The ceremonies starting this April 30th will end on May 1st. They will take place in the most beautiful hall of the Imperial Palace and will be broadcast on public channels. Several heads of state and many personalities are expected at the Imperial Palace and Shinto shrines, a religion that governs the imperial rites in part. Naruhito, 59 years, thus becomes the new symbol of the people and will defend the unity of the nation according to the definition given by the Constitution, which came into effect in 1947 and which stipulates that every emperor must print his mark and continue the work of his father. The Ivorian international defender of Manchester United, due to knee injury, will not play the rest of the season and miss the 2019 African Cup of Nations. Eric Bailly injured his right knee in Sunday's Premier League game against Chelsea at Old Trafford. The problem is that the Ivorian international footballer will no longer play for the Red Devils this season, according to Manchester United in a statement. Moreover, Bailly will no longer be able to participate in the next African Cup of Nations, added the English football club. The 25-year-old Ivorian suffered an internal ligament injury in a collision with midfielder Mateo Kovacic in the 1-1 draw against Chelsea. Ivory Coast is one of the favorites of the tournament, scheduled for June 21st to July 19th in Egypt. Côte d'Ivoire will play the first round against Morocco, South Africa, and Namibia. In Ivory Coast, no official statement or comment on the 2020 presidential elections in the country. Ivorians remain on hold. The current president consults his political base, and the opposition parties are already regrouping, and the presidential elections are far from over. Unexpectedly appointed after the resignation of Soumeylou Boubèye Maïga, his predecessor, following a motion of censure tabled against him at the National Assembly, the new Prime Minister, Dr. Boubou Cissé, was welcomed by a burst of negative opinions. That's all for our newscast today. Stay tuned on Gabon 24 for more news.